everyone. Welcome back to Life Unpotted. This is Sophie here.
Hey, welcome back. This is Daisy.
We are feeling really excited. Last week, we had an awesome interview with our friend Cam Rosin. If you guys haven't listened to that episode, you definitely should. But just what we've been hearing about that episode, what we've been hearing about the community, people are getting excited. And it's making me feel really excited because I'm just like, wow, this is happening. This vision that we have of building this community is happening, and it just really reminds me of the importance of not giving up, because there have been so many times throughout starting this podcast, we might be hitting a year mark of when we started, where when you don't get the immediate gratification, it's hard to keep going. But just to show in life, like, sometimes it takes time to build out that thing you want to build out, and you got to just keep going. So I'm feeling really excited about that. Just on one note, I just want to let you know, guys know, if you haven't listened to that, definitely check it out. And as always, if you haven't rated or reviewed our podcast, we'd really, really appreciate that, because it just helps us growing. It helps us gaining the momentum that we need to gain to keep going with this and keep connecting with more and more people. So that's just a little intro. But for today's episode, what we're going to talk about is unlearning. Right? Self-reflection. I have been going through so much self-reflection over the past year, and the amount of things I am learning about myself, it's incredible. Whether that's realizing that, oh wait, I actually like to try to show off in front of certain people, or I like to appear a certain way, or I actually have tendencies to control or take things personally, or feel like I'm being excluded, or all of these little things that are so nuanced, and they exist in such a way that we might not even be able to recognize them, because a lot of time they are just built into who we are. They are built into this person. You know, I'm Sophie. I have had all these years in my life, and that is this identity I have now created. This is the identity now that I am immersing in the world with. And when you get to the point where you start reflecting and you start going to therapy, you start journaling, whatever way that looks for you, and you're able to see yourself, I think that's where the growth really starts to happen, when you're like, wow, that's how I've been living. That's who I am. So I think this episode can kind of be just about that. Reflection, unlearning, changing, realizing you're really not who you thought you are. And that can be in such a granular level, or that could be a really big picture, your relationship, your identity, your sexuality, your career. So let's just get started. I don't know, Daisy, if you like, I have so many things I'm unlearning, but why don't you let us know, like, what are your thoughts about this?
Great intro. I recently have been going through a big transition. I've mentioned a few times, for those of you who are avid listeners, that I left my job, and it was a long time coming. It wasn't in the direction that I've always wanted to go in, which is in the realm of food. I just got to a point where it was doing me no favor to work at this place anymore, because it wasn't in what was alignment for me. So reason I bring that up is because it's very uncomfortable when you're in the in-between phase of allowing yourself to figure out what is next. And that's not something that really is deemed acceptable by your conditioning to be an active member of the society. So I left my job 2.5 weeks ago. And just yesterday, I allowed myself to really reflect, because I jumped right into creating a rigid schedule for myself of, I need to do this for 5 hours of the day on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then X, Y, and Z Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 5 hours of the day. And that is what I am currently unlearning, is the need to work in a very rigid manner within the 9 to 5, 9 to 6 hours, like that time frame, like having to basically creating an environment for myself to be an employee in again. So, or creating kind of like a trap for myself to exist within is what I'm unlearning, that I'm allowed to just figure it out. And reflection goes right along with unlearning, because without reflection, self-reflection, we're not going to unlearn. So just as much as working hard and striving for things is important, taking time to do nothing and reflect is, I would argue, just as important, because you have to put thought into it to figure out what is your next step. So that is a little bit different from what you're unlearning, but that's what's top of mind for me today. So I'm sure we can meet in the middle of of coming together with those two unlearning point of views.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I'm unlearning too, to give myself the space, to give myself the permission to relax. It is so, so, so interesting to me. The more I do this reflection, the more that I realize that we really do live in a world where you're not really told ever that you should be just being, just reflecting, just processing your emotions. There's not this carve out time in life that the world gives you to say, hey, you know what? Amidst all the chaos that everything's going on, you should really be processing your trauma. You should really be thinking about what you really want to do in life. Our life is so fast paced. Society, the way that everything operates is so fast paced. And I have done so much reflection about this. I'm almost finished reading New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. Amazing, amazing, amazing book. And so much what he talks about is that the world is so consumed living out their outer purpose. They're living out in their form. Form meaning everything external, right? What you're doing, who you're doing, what you're wearing, what kind of life you're doing on the outside. And what he talks a lot about is that when people get older, when they get closer to death, that form starts to change. It starts, obviously as you get older, your body shrinkles. As you get older, your body changes. You start to get gray hair, you start to get wrinkles, and that form that we have identified with our whole life, that we have attached to so much, starts to change. And he was drawing this really interesting comparison to the Eastern and Western world. In the Western world, when you get older, you're kind of disregarded in society. People don't really care that much about you because if your form is not capable of doing things, if your external world is not at the level that society needs it to be, which was what happens as you get older. In most cases, there comes a point where you are more limited. Society in the Western world doesn't value that as much. But on the Eastern world, where a lot of these principles, Buddhism and everything originated, there is so much emphasis that is put onto people who are older because they recognize that they have reached this level of spiritual awakening. They have reached this level of connecting with their inner purpose, their inner world. And I had one of these moments where I was like, wow, like I spent so much of my life caught up in my external world, my external purpose. And it's not that you shouldn't think about those things, right? As I'm making the shift right now, as I'm self-reflecting, as I'm recognizing I want to make all these drastic shifts in my life, my external world is also going to shift. It's not that you don't need to put emphasis on that, but I think it's just recognizing that there just isn't enough. I don't really know. I think that I'm just blown away by how much I've neglected processing, thinking, reflecting about who I am. And yeah.
I totally get what you mean in that last part. It hit me kind of a mix of what you said with the Eckhart Tolle quote, talking about how Eastern world values the inside, the spiritual experience, if not more than the external experience. And we in America, or in the Western world, we don't give that as much thought. And it's interesting to think like your entire life really has been defined by your external world, clinging to these things outside of you, setting up, your career or sports you were playing as a kid, or everything was outside of you. Like neither of us grew up religious. So, that is a component that we didn't grow up with. And I don't wish that was any other way, but it's not really ingrained into our culture, at least where we grew up, to have this questioning of just like this, like more of like spirituality. Like it's a very new world to both of us. And when you see this new spiritual world, and I don't love the term spiritual because it can be misleading, confusing. Everyone has their own judgments attached to it. But I think it's the best way to describe it is when you realize there's just something like it comes down to really processing your fragility as a human being and how you could die at any moment, realizing that place a different value on your time. So you are less likely, in my experience, to attach, not that I don't still attach to things outside of me, certain amount of likes, a certain amount of, getting a certain job with certain pay, like all these kinds of things. But it doesn't have as big of a weight anymore. You're able to detach from that and go deeper because realizing that that's not the only world I exist in anymore. There's also the world of within me that can never be taken away, that I can never be fired from, that I can never, anything can never be wrong with that. So to circle back to what you were saying, I think it's just really important to recognize that there's something within us that is infinite. And that's really deep. Once you realize that death isn't scary then, once you realize there's something in you that's infinite. That always has been. Like if you think about just one more thing, once you start to process your potential mortality, you start to question, well, who was here before me and before me and before me and before me? And then you look at the trees and you look at the sky and you look at the birds and you see this entire world operating together that to a naked eye, you wouldn't notice the collective energy of everything working together. And you are a part of that as well. It's just a matter if you're aware of it or not. And I find a lot of comfort in being aware of that.
I totally agree. One thing I've really, really started to understand, it's this interesting shift I think that's happening when you've put a lot of work into trying to understand something. It's happening for me now where I've conceptually understood the concept of we are one, we are all connected for a long time. But the more and more I am truly fascinated by the amount of people I'm connecting with who have the same exact experiences as me. They judge themselves just as much as me. They're insecure just as much as I am. They don't think people like them. They think people are talking about them. And I've had more and more interactions with people or being engaged in certain communities of having vulnerable conversations that it really has hit me that our brains all process things in the same way, that we are all going through the same things in this human experience. And why does that matter? Because number one, it means you're not alone. But number two, that in and of itself has created a separation to recognize that I am separate from all these emotions, from all these thoughts that I have experienced in my life, this identity that I have attached to my whole life, because those just exist in the ether as a human that everybody experiences, that everybody else also is experiencing. So of course that can't be who I am. I can't be this person who actually is an anxious person when you also experience anxiety also. When we recognize how these emotions are just felt at large, globally, anxiety, fear, insecurity, grief, all these feelings, anxiety, fear, grief, depression, sadness, anger, when these are emotions that we all share, you can find that space to separate the emotions from yourself, because you start to realize, wait a minute, this doesn't mean that I'm a shitty person. This doesn't mean something's wrong with me. This is just everybody else's experience. Mm-hmm. And one more thing I just want to say, I'm like, how come I never knew this?
Right.
And I think the reason is because I haven't had vulnerable, real conversations with other people to really understand, oh, wait, this is an experience everybody shares.
Yeah. An antidote to that.
Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. I just wrote down two separate things. So at the core of my life, I think achievement has been, even if I am an average person who has achieved average things in my life, I feel like I have been fueled by achievement. I think a lot of people are. Even, it doesn't mean that you're a high achiever. I think that is just what is at the core of our culture, is achieving. And I think when that happens, that leads to pain and suffering, because you're looking for all of that value outside of you. But you can't forget that what is inside of you is infinite. So when you look through life, when you go to life through a lens of connection, that leads to just a feeling of love. And that means a deeper connection with yourself, because you have control over that. You control about how you operate. And a deeper connection with those around you who also have that deep connection with themselves. So I think that is what has been happening to me in the last few years, is that my frame of reference for how I live life has shifted away from purely just achievement. And it shifted more into connection. And that, of course, first starts with connection with myself. I've learned to connect with myself instead of looking to get that validation from achieving. And I think that was the biggest shift for me, because I would get so stuck into cycles of needing to get this value from something outside of me that I didn't even actually like, but that was the only way I knew to get that connection, was to achieve or to strive for something, try to be something for someone else. So I think that's kind of those are the terms that come to mind for me, because at the end of the day, if you're not aware of what you're not aware, you don't know what you don't know. And there's a catalyst somewhere in my life that started this.
I was thinking, I think the catalyst for me must have been therapy. I was trying to pinpoint what was the catalyst to make me wake up. I really think it was starting therapy, because I've like dabbled with therapy my whole life, but it wasn't until I found like a good therapist who I really connected with that I think the self-reflection started.
Well, going back to self-reflection, you are on autopilot without self-reflection. You are on autopilot without self-reflection, without stopping, pausing. You can just be walking with someone else's thoughts in your head. I think I think the first place, it definitely was, again, like for me, also finding a good therapist where I resisted any sort of feelings or emotions, but starting to understand them and not resist them and start to work with them. So I think at that point, you're not punishing yourself as much once you're able to connect with those intense emotions inside. And at the end of the day, that allows you to connect with yourself. So that is interesting.
Speaking of therapy, so one thing I've become aware of is my relationship with crying. Like, I realized that I've felt really uncomfortable kind of crying for, I guess, my life. Like, it wasn't this thing I was able to be like, oh, I need to cry. Like, I'm going to go and do that and connect to myself and journal and like try to like really give myself the self-love. I didn't really know how to do that. And I realized that like I'm scared to cry in therapy. Like I'm scared to cry in therapy. And I thought at first I was like, oh, you know, I don't want to cry in front of her. But I'm realizing like my relationship with connecting with certain emotions, it's so deeply ingrained that you shouldn't. Like, I don't know. I just don't feel like I ever learned as a kid, like, oh, you should cry to process yourself. Oh, you should sit there and really, really try to give yourself that love. Like, if you asked me 2 years ago to sit in a room and cry and, like, try to sit there and really feel the emotions, I'd be like, oh, my God, that's so uncomfortable. But recently, the way I've kind of been connecting with myself is, like, I've been doing a lot of yoga. Yoga has really been helping me process my feelings. There's so many times after I've done yoga where I do cry or I do have a realization, and I am finding ways to move my body in a kind of way that is connected to this journey I'm on. And it's so beautiful because it's giving me like that place to process things. But I think the point I do want to make here is that like I'm unlearning feeling uncomfortable about crying. I'm unlearning feeling scared to cry, being scared to look at those feelings. I am recognizing that I have to look at the feelings. I have to look at the feelings. And I didn't realize how scared I have been my whole life to look at feelings. And like you're saying, like I swear, like this is like, it's hitting me like a different level where I'm just like, wow. You could say self-love, you could say self-reflection, you could say all these things, but it's not until you start to really look in hindsight and you're like, wow, I have not given myself any of that for the past whatever years. I have just been merely existing, going back and forth in this life, but I've been so disconnected from myself.
Well, you never had the skill set.
Yes.
To connect with yourself. And when you don't have the skill set, when you don't have the exposure, and I think that's like what's great about the age of information is that anyone can be exposed to this information.
So talking about skill set, so I think I have found journaling to be so helpful in my self-growth, self-reflection journey. And at first I was kind of intimidated to journal. I didn't really know what to journal about. I have felt a lot of pressure when it comes to writing because I'm like, I want it to be perfect, whatever. But finally I was like, you know what, just put the pen to paper and just start writing your thoughts down. And I did. And it's been about 2 years of journaling, and I have a bunch of different notebooks. And recently what I've been doing is going back and reading my journals from a year ago. There's no better way to reflect on your growth, to reflect on your feelings, to see yourself, in my experience, than to pick up your journal from a year ago and read it. It can sound so simple. I think these concepts sound so simple in concept, in theory, but I don't think I ever knew what it was meant to see myself. I don't think I ever knew what it meant. I don't think I ever knew what it meant to be able to have all these thoughts patterns, all these emotions reflected back and say, oh, right. that's how I felt 1 year ago, and this is how I feel now.
Right.
So I encourage anybody to journal. I encourage anybody to find a forum that they can reflect their thoughts on, that they can look back in hindsight, because otherwise, I don't know, I think you just need some kind of forum that's going to reflect back to you what you're going through.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I was actually talking about this earlier, like even going back to your hometown, somewhere that you have a bunch of memories and experiences can reflect to you what has been happening in your current life. But what I wanted to say, what you said about journaling made me think about where if I heard what you were just saying two or 3 years ago, I would be like, okay, every Monday at 9 a.m., every Wednesday at 9 a.m., and every Friday at 9 a.m., every day for that matter, I need to wake up and I need to journal. And I think that if that was me 3 years ago, I would be missing the point entirely, because it's not about needing to do something and checking it off. It's actually about doing whatever the hell your body tells you to do. And that's something that I'm unlearning is rigidity. Thinking that if you have an equation, it's always going to equal some sort of result. And that's just not how emotions, connection with yourself, none of that works. Like when it comes down to it, it's something that I've struggled with, because it's like, oh, it's identifying with one of these like healing modalities of thinking, if I'm a journaler, I need to be journaling every morning. Or if I'm a runner, I need to be running 5 days a week. If I'm a yogi, I need to have my certification. I need to be doing handstands every Monday morning, every Tuesday morning. And I think for so long, I tried to cling to that. And then I like, my body just doesn't feel good. I'm burnt out. I just can't do this right now. I would then go to the deep end and not do anything. So I think it's more or less just like waking up and each morning and like giving yourself a moment. And I liked what you said about yoga. It's like, it doesn't even have to be called yoga. Just like sitting on the floor or like a mat of some sort and just like, it's whatever works for you. There's no right way to do anything. You can get to this means of an end. You can get to this end. You can get to this place through really just listening to yourself. That's the entire point. It's not about you don't need a journal. You don't have to do that if it doesn't work for you. Like for me, like it was drawing because words were intimidating the point is that there's no right way to do any of this, but just getting started is what is important, I think. And I hope I'm not sounding preachy.
No, I think that's the whole point of this podcast. Like we've talked a lot about in the self-help industry, it kind of sometimes it is sold to you that there is a formula that you have to follow in order to feel better. You have to do X, Y, Z. You have to journal every day, you have to whatever every day. And I think it's that rigidity that actually can put you in the wrong direction, because then again, you start being so hard on yourself. You start putting so much pressure on yourself.
Well, the equation that we have for success in the business world, or I don't know, Hollywood, all these other things that are rigid, that are very, I don't know, are within like the patriarchal structure of how our society runs, of like the intensity it runs on. I think it's easy to bring that intensity into trying to achieve things that are in means spiritual, are in means inside of us. And that's something you have to unlearn altogether, to let go of that, because you're missing the point that there's no achievement that you actually need. It's a feeling, and it's an experience in each moment. And I think that is the hardest thing to unlearn, and insanely difficult to unlearn. I catch myself in it all the time.
Yeah. I have two things I want to say. I've thought so much about this recently of like, I don't know how to, you're like, oh, what have you thought about? It's like almost like I don't know how to operate in a way that I'm not just trying to achieve a means to an end. I don't know how to operate in a way where I'm not putting so much pressure on myself. I am trying to unlearn all the self-created pressure I put on myself to be perfect.
Self-created pressure. Yeah.
To have things be amazing.
Oh, yeah.
10 out of 10. I didn't realize how much pressure I've put on myself my whole life until this is something I think is so fascinating. I am realizing recently that I have kind of been a perfectionist the past 5-10 years. Mm-hmm. If you had ever asked me if I thought I was a perfectionist, I'd say no. I have imposter syndrome. I actually don't even think I'm that smart. I don't actually think I'm any of these things. I don't even think I'm good at anything. So it's so interesting how at the same time, I kind of was doing all these things that I couldn't see, but because I was so caught up in these labels and identities about myself, like oh, I don't think I'm smart. I don't think I'm all these things. I think that blinded me from being able to see what was actually happening. If that kind of makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
so I think now that
You're in your head, not in reality.
right, I've been in my head so much, but
Yeah.
now I'm less in my head. It's like I'm able to be like, wait a minute, I think I actually am a perfectionist. Like I have been acting in that role for so long, or
Yeah.
I think we all kind of are, right? Like everything needs
Outcome
to be
driven.
outcome driven.
And sometimes when you're outcome driven, especially in a creative space or just in like a finding peace space, you're actually not going to get where you want to get because you can't always just plug an equation in. Like that is not life. That may be factors of life. That may be certain things. But with the larger picture of life, like that's not how it works. Like you can't just plug an equation in and you no longer are sick, right? You can't just plug an equation in and you're no longer stressed. Like it's just not how it works.
That I love that. Like it's so true. Like everything has. We always feel like things have this equation of like I have to do this to get that. I have to do this to get this place. And if I'm trying all these things and it's not working, then what's wrong? Why is this not happening? Right? And I think it was Alan Watts who was talking about when you see a flower and you feel like it's so beautiful, there's no reason that you feel like a flower is beautiful. Like you can't explain it. It just is. A lot of things in life just are. But we have overcomplicated life so much to put it into boxes, to put it into metrics, to put it into this uniform system that, and of course, you go to school. You have to graduate, you have to go to high school, you have to go to college, you have to go get a job. We are told that our life has to be so formulaic. But when it comes to healing, when it comes to self-growth, if you try to approach it with a very rigid, formulaic way, I don't think that's going to work because you might just end up putting even more pressure on yourself because there's no set formula for any of this.
Yeah,
Connecting with yourself is not something that I can tell you exactly how to do.
It's so messy.
It's so messy and life is messy. And there's
can't.
beauty that comes from that. So if we're looking for the lens of like, if we're looking through the lens of everything has to be perfect, everything has to line up, everything has to make sense. Well, if I'm doing this, if I'm starting this podcast, I need to know exactly how that's going to relate to the rest of my life. I need to know exactly where that fits in. If we're looking through everything with such pressure to fit into a box, we're missing that creative flow, that beauty of just being and like living as a human being, the way that you see the squirrel running up and down the tree outside or nature. You see nature existing. Spring has just sprung and it just does it so elegantly. And us humans just struggle so much to replicate that same level of ease in the things that we do. And I am unlearning the pressure I put in myself. I am unlearning feeling like I can't approach things staying calm and relaxed. I'm unlearning feeling like everything in life has to feel like so much pressure because that's not how I want to live my life.
Pressure, right. And something I'm unlearning is, so I'm taking a course right now in holistic nutrition, more of a way to get inspiration, learn more, use that as a jumping off point. And I'll be honest, like my association with achievement is stress. So something I'm realizing is I'm doing something that I want to do and I'm enjoying it, but like, why do I go into it feeling so stressed and so rigid? Because my equation of success means being stressed. It has to be serious. And I'm really trying to question why I feel like I need to take these things that are so enjoyable and make myself feel stressed about them. Like, why can't I approach it from a playful manner? And this is something that I think being at a job that it wasn't deeply attached to like something that I loved and cared about. And this is what initially, this thing I'm unlearning is what initially drove me into a job that it wasn't something that I was deeply passionate and didn't deeply care about. So I'm kind of re-emerging into realizing when I really deeply care about something, a lot of stress comes up because I put all of this, like my entire life, my entire outcome is going to come from this very moment and how well I study something. And it's a very humbling experience because it's a new experience. And I think that is a great, I think it's good that I'm experiencing this because it's really testing me of all right, to calm the body down. Don't approach this from a stress point of view. And something else I was thinking about in this regards was when it comes to existing, I think in this state of connectivity versus of achievement, knowing that you can achieve things while also still feeling like there's something infinite within you that allows you to connect with yourself and others. Right now I'm kind of looking for a new job. It's kind of like not what I want. It's an interesting spot, but it's really puts you in an interesting place to zoom out, and you kind of are no longer a part of this working world, and you're like, do I want to go back into that, or how do I create a different kind of environment for myself to where I don't have to play into the delusion of this is so important? How can I make money in a way that isn't that? And I don't know if this will make sense, but I think the biggest point is realizing that no matter what your situation is, if you want to make change, you can, because it comes from within. And it takes, like leaving my job was really scary, also really exciting. And then now it's just kind of like, all right, what's next? So I think we have to, I've mentioned this before, but we have to stall out to get to a place we really want to be. We have to have mishaps and have times where it doesn't feel good. And those are the times we cherish, because that's what's going to lead us to a place that we get to create our experience.
I just want to say to anyone who's listening, like, as someone who has done work for the past, I guess I would say the real work is like 2 years, maybe? I don't know. Year?
Who knows?
Like, you got to like stick with it, because the amount of realizations I am having now, the ways I am seeing things that I never have seen before, it is honestly, it feels life-changing. Honestly, it feels life-changing that I am looking at this world, I am looking at this life in an entirely new perspective. It is, for the first time ever, again, I've comprehended these things intellectually in concept, but I embodied an understanding recently that, wow, my value is not my success. Mm-hmm. I physically felt the space. I am learning to feel this. I'm starting to feel the space between me and my success. I'm starting to feel the space between me and all these external things in the world. And I didn't know that even was possible 2 months ago. Literally, I did not know that I have said those words, you have to be separate from your success. But it was not until last week where I was sitting there, I think after I'd done yoga, I was like, it hit, where I was like, wow, my value has to come from within. Because anytime I'm placing my value externally, every external object is in flux. Every single thing is in flux. Even the person you love, even your relationship, even your most coveted job, every single thing is in flux. Mm-hmm. So how can I feel stable in this world? By looking within. Because that is the only single thing ever that we can have in this human experience that we can try to find stability in, is our inner knowing that we are complete. We are okay. We are beautiful no matter what. Like, if you get fired, it doesn't mean you're a shitty person. If you get broken up with, it doesn't mean you're freaking out. Like, if you get broken up with, it doesn't mean that you're a failure. All these things my whole life have been so intertwined. Mm-hmm. And I think now I'm actually like, the window is opening up and the sun's coming in. I'm like, why has the window been shut for the past 29 years? So
I feel that.
And I also just want to say to people who are listening, reading books I have never been a big reader, ever. Like, I always classify myself, I can't focus, I can't read. Another identity I've boxed myself into. But I started reading stuff I enjoyed. A lot of Eckhart Tolle, Alan Watts, just ordered The Untethered Soul, which I had not read yet. Reading these books has really helped me grow too. So there's no equation to any of this, but it's just starting to immerse yourself and starting to push yourself through all the things you think you can't do. Because if I had given up a year ago and said, oh, this is really freaking hard, I would never have got to this point.
I think the ultimate thing to unlearn is that difficulty can look different than waking up really early, grinding yourself to the bone, and going to bed really late. Especially coming from New York City, I felt like when I moved here, like that was how you achieved. But I'm unlearning that that's not the case. It can be slowing down, going inward, being quiet, questioning what your feelings, attaching to your feelings, understanding them, and letting them go and letting them flow, and not having to let them stop you in your tracks. Because I've realized on this experience we're having that there really is always a path back to a negative emotion that you didn't let free. No matter who you are, no one's immune to that. It's going to come out in some way, shape, or form. So no one is immune to not understanding your emotions, to not processing them, to not understanding them and working with them. It's always going to find its way back to you. So next time, I'm talking to myself, but next time you feel like waking up and doing yoga, going for a run, and taking care of yourself as a way to start your morning isn't enough, really question that, because that is doing so much for yourself. You're doing so much for yourself in that moment. Waking up and just sitting still for an hour, 2 hours, letting your mind be silent. That is hard work. Just because it looks quote unquote soft or gentle, that doesn't mean that it's not some of the most important work you can do to better yourself and everyone around you.
That is the hardest, most important work you will do in your life. It's questioning all of these things of yourself, really getting to know yourself, yet it is not coveted in the way that becoming a CEO of a company is.
Right. Exactly.
And
exactly. Why?
It is the most important thing. Because if there's any reason to live, if there's any reason to embark on this journey in this one time that you're alive on this earth, wouldn't it be to get to know yourself and then from there live your life freely? Wouldn't that be the reason?
Right. Going back to what you said, to touch things out, or to let a lasting listening. I don't know what I was trying to say there. Going back to what you were saying, of how the only way to have a stable life is to get your value from within and not attach it to things outside of you, because everything else is in flux. Everything around us is in flux. Nothing in this world has stayed the same. The only consistency in this world is change. So stability has to come from understanding your values within and focusing on that and giving love to that environment, that world inside of you. Like, the world becomes so much bigger when you feed the world inside of you and realize that infiniteness within you.
I like what you said to me today. You're like, I was texting you about something at work, and you're like, the more you show yourself, the more that, what did you say? Like,
oh, the more you show parts of yourself that are vulnerable, the more that's going to be reflected back to you through the people who come into your life.
And then your life starts shifting. You start interacting with people in ways you never could have imagined. And yeah,
I mean, that's what this podcast is. It's allowed us to connect with amazing people who are also thinking these things. And
this, if we're talking about things that have helped me, this podcast has become a source of therapy for me to reflect all the things on my mind. And
not even therapy in like a sense of like,
it's therapeutic.
Infiniteness. It's things beyond us, out of our control, that everyone's a part of once they're aware of it. And I think that is such a niche environment that you don't see day to day. And the internet's a beautiful place because you start to realize that you're not the only one who thinks about this. And there's so much power in numbers and connectedness and beauty and encouragement, and it's just really amazing.
And it's so interesting how like anything that's in numbers, like, oh, is that a cult?
Right. I know. It's a shame how
someone commented on Cam's video today and was like, oh, this sounds like a cult introduction. I'm like, yeah. So you're just thrown in because you've never seen a bunch of people who are actually working collectively together. Like, it's, yeah, I completely agree on that.
I don't know. I think that you can never, that's when you do something out of blindness. Like, you have to like do this for yourself.
Yeah. I could talk for hours about things I'm learning, like imposter syndrome. I think as we're progressing through this podcast, we are kind of scratching the surface on topics that we are going through in real time. And we're we're talking about things in real time as we go through them. Like these, I think what makes this podcast so, I don't know, I think just being able to share these experiences on the podcast about how we're experiencing things in real time, there's so many things we're going to talk about because we are sharing with you, the listener, all these experiences that we're peeling back, all these things we're realizing about ourselves. So we're just going to do it on this forum so that it can hopefully help you, that it could help you when you're listening to this, say, oh, wait, maybe that relates to me, because oftentimes all we need is to relate, to for something to resonate with us, to click and go, okay, wait, that kind of makes sense. Oh, wait.
Yeah.
To get it off autopilot, right? I think
Totally.
having that community, having that relatability, having that space to have it reflect back to you of things that you might be experiencing is so, so, so important, because that's not, you don't walk outside, you don't really see that.
Totally.
So that's why I love this podcast, and I think this is a great way to start touching on this topic of unlearning things. We need to go more in depth. There's so many things to say, but for purposes of time, I think that's kind of like a good way to start on this topic.
Right. And there's so much there. Oops. And yeah, there's so much to unlearn. It's a lifetime's worth of things to unlearn, but it's to enjoy while we're unlearning, to be aware of what we can gain from unlearning and the differences it can make in our life and how we experience it. And there's no place to get at the end of the day. It's not a competition of who can unlearn more, right?
That's another thing to be careful with.
Yeah. So
like, it's like, oh, I really like when Eckhart Tolle talks about like the
whenever we try to close out, we just go into more conversation.
Well, I'm saying like how the ego can come up when you're working through healing of like, oh, I am this spiritually healed person, I'm better than you. And it's just like, well, back again is clinging to an identity. So there's no perfect way to do any of this. Everyone has their own way of doing it. And it's not about feeling like your life will be more complete if you have two journals that you can look back on and reflect. No, it doesn't mean anything about your value. These are just tools in our toolkit to move forward and to try to make sense of everything that's happening.
There's a lot of beauty in making sense of what's happening. I think that's the crux of our existence.
We're just making sense of what's happening.
Making sense of what's happening. I like that tagline. So I think that's a good place to end. We'll be back next Tuesday, but think about what you have learned and what you could possibly unlearn. I mean, think about your entire life experience, or just think about, or I think the best way to do this is tap into what you're feeling right now. And if there's something you're not feeling, if there's something you're feeling doesn't feel good, tap into that a little more. Question, what conditioning taught me this thing that doesn't make me feel good?
Right.
You have to go deep. It's like a thread. It's like you're pulling a thread, and it's more and it's more and it's more. And you keep going, and it's going to feel really, really fucking shitty. It's going to feel really, really bad. It's going to feel horrible. But you have to keep going. Because there is relief at the end of that, because there's explanation. And honestly, this is stuff that I feel like if I didn't have a therapist early on, I wouldn't have been able to get there. Because you have to tap into, and I always say my stomach, you have to tap into what you're feeling in your gut, in your stomach. Like you have to feel that connectedness. And that's where I feel it could be other places for other people, but like that's where it all begins, I believe. Yeah. So that is my sending off thoughts, my last thoughts. Sophie, do you have any thoughts?
No, I just want to say thanks everyone for listening. Thank you so much for being a part of this community. It means a lot to us to have you be along for the ride, because we're just in the beginning and the journey's going to keep going. So enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the rest of your evening, wherever you are, and we'll talk to you on Tuesday. See you then.